This is my review of the ATA June 23rd edition, June 2013 edition, excuse me, of the ATA Chronicle. So there's a few noteworthy things about this edition, and I haven't compared it to other ones extensively, but I found it to be very insightful and a good mix of content relating to the sort of nuts and bolts of the profession, tips for interpreters and translators to pick up on, everything ranging from the context around translation as far as managing your own business and the things it takes to be successful, and right down to sort of the useful tips for particular settings. And then, of course, some institutional related things to the American Translators Association itself, such as advertisements for upcoming conferences, reflections from the president of the ATA, or president-elect in this case, Caitlin Walsh. So let me go into some of the specific content that I found the most interesting. The first article that I really found to be quite engaging was the review that took place of Corinne McKay's new book, Thoughts on Translation. And the review was pretty much a straightforward summary of the book and some reflection, but what I found useful about the review was pointing out how important it is, just as the book does, for as translators us to be not just cognizant of developing the sort of hard, concrete skills of our profession, but knowing that those skills will never have a chance to be implemented and developed over time and honed over time if we're not good business people at the same time. And so there were some really practical and useful thoughts in that that I found at least could be very helpful as for people, particularly those of us who are just developing sort of the freelance part of our careers. So she talked about also some issues. It wasn't just straightforward tips and advice. It was also some issues where she presented two sides of the story. One, for example, regarding tests. Apparently there's a lot of translators who will refuse to do unpaid work, essentially, for a company that is giving them something to translate just as a test of their skill. And she seems to lean towards saying that, well, on the one hand, of course, that we should value our labor enough to not be doing free work, except for at our own choosing. On the other hand, saying how much is it worthwhile to make a principled stand on that particular moment in that test and potentially sacrifice your ability to gain that as a client, or at least as a referral source for new clients. So I thought that was an interesting and more nuanced part of that article. The second one was called "A Bridge Too Far," and it's about the politics of translation and interpreting, which was interesting to me in a lot of ways. This particular translator works a lot in Spain and some of the territories within Spain that have their own national identities, the Catalan region in particular, along with, of course, the Basque region and others in Spain, where there are very strong, in some cases, separatist movements, in other cases, movements that may not be seeking outright autonomy, but certainly recognition of the distinct nature of the distinct political entities within their regions, their distinct cultures and languages, etc. And this author, essentially, he didn't provide answers per se to what's the best way to handle those sorts of situations, more sort of a list of the factors to take into account when making complicated decisions about how to translate very politically weighted language, such as that around national identity. Do you refer to the Catalan region as an autonomous region? Do you even use the word region to refer to it? Or do you refer to it with language more akin to that you would use with another nation state? And he talked about having to take into account, for example, who's the audience that will be reading it, who is the person who commissioned the translation. That is, at least if you hope to preserve them as a future client, you obviously need to take into account what are going to be their politics and preferences around this. And this translator actually said that depending on different clients asking for similar content to be translated, he might translate it in different ways, which is on the one hand interesting and smart, on the other hand a potential ethical issue. And it also brings up once again the theme of, is it possible to maintain neutrality, and is choosing to follow the will of the client necessarily escape hatch to the question of the inherent political nature of the work that we're doing when we make the decisions about how to translate particular phases. So I thought that article was very engaging at a theoretical level, but tying the theoretical to the practical and I liked that he brought in the concrete examples. The next article was about speech pool, which is, to me, a very exciting idea. I was a little disappointed, at least in the Spanish section of the actual website, but it does seem like an exciting idea to have a pool of content for interpreters to practice from online, particularly speeches and speeches that are classified and labeled by the accents that are involved in them, the subject matter, etc. Could be a very useful tool. Being myself somebody who teaches interpreting classes, I'm always looking for new ideas for how to engage interpreters and get them to really practice some of the nuance involved in doing simultaneous interpreting for speakers from a variety of backgrounds. And so I will be looking for the article mentioned that there may be other sources for finding online material for practicing interpreting from. So I'm going to look into some of those and also hope that SpeechPool continues to grow and get better. But in general, it was an interesting point about how technology can not just be a tool that helps us in our profession, but it can be a tool that helps us in learning how to get better at our professions. So that was an interesting article. The next article was from an interpreter who was talking about interpreting in prison, and it was very practical to the basics, things to keep in account, particularly for herself as a woman interpreting in prisons. Things like dressing modestly, preparing oneself for the content within the prison system, which can be very emotionally charged and depressing, as she puts it. So that was an interesting one. Probably my favorite article from here was the Interpreters Forum. So this appears to now be not a feature, but a regular section, which is where, and so this one was by Maria Cristina de la Vega, who is an interpreter she's in Florida right now, and she runs a blog. She has her own blog called Maria Cristina de la Vega Musings.wordpress.com, which is, by the way, something that I've noticed that a lot of the interpreters that are publishing in here run their own blogs. Makes me wonder about whether and when one should start a blog talking about our work. But what I liked about her article was talking about how there are, and I find this all the time, interpreters who are very good at the hard skills but impossible to get along with as individuals because of assumptions or competition or lack of a cooperative spirit. And she really makes the point, which I think is a very good point, about how important it is to approach this work with a collaborative point of view and with good human skills, with good human interactions. After all, our profession, whether we're interpreters or translators or a mix of both, is all about communication, and communication is an inherently collective process unless we're talking to ourselves. So then after that was sort of some more of the standard parts of the review, including member news about several members of the ATA who've been published, and advertisements again for the conference, and there was a dictionary review that was interesting by Peter Gerge, where he went over a particular Russian-English dictionary. Not being a Russian-English speaker, I didn't think I would have much to learn from this article, but just his perspective on it and the idea of reviewing dictionaries had never occurred to me. So a somewhat funny column called Humor in Translation by a gentleman named Mark Herman, where he put up a long poem that basically shows all of some of the funny things in the Spanish language, words that can be easily misunderstood, or words that, by emphasizing a different syllable, can mean something that is so completely different. And I think that it's funny if you speak Spanish. It probably wasn't too funny if you don't, because when you read his translation, which he says is just is something that he sort of did off of the cuff, and is something that is mostly done. He calls it his poor attempt at a literal translation. It's mostly done to show how difficult it can be to translate humor. You wouldn't really have any idea what they're talking about from the English literal translation. And I don't know if there is a possibility to do any better than he did, honestly, given the fact that the entire poem is about very particular language nuances to the Spanish language. So it was both humorous and somewhat thought-provoking. And then there's a list of upcoming events, upcoming ATA webinars, some advertisements, and that is the end of the June 2013 issue of the ATA Chronicle.